Can turbulence actually flip an airplane upside down? I want to answer that question directly. But first, I want to tell you about the most violent turbulence I ever experienced in 50 years of flying. I remember there were clear skies, no warning, 37,000 feet. And for a few seconds, every alarm on that airplane went off, all at once, all at the same time. Here's what happened. And here's what it proved about how safe you actually are. But before I get into this, if you're a nervous flyer and you want a complete guide to help you through your next flight, I put one together, and it's completely free. The link is in the description below. Check it out when you get through the video. Personal story of mine. It was the year 1998. I was flying an MD-11 wide-body 3-engine cargo jet. It's going westbound from Oakland, California to Indianapolis, Indiana. It was a morning flight. The weather was absolutely beautiful. I remember there were sunny skies, not a cloud in sight. Everything was as smooth as glass at 37,000 feet. What could go wrong? Now, what I want to mention is something about the MD-11 aircraft. Among pilots who fly it or who flew it, it was well known for having some, let's call them unusual flight characteristics compared to other commercial jets. It was and still is a capable airplane, but it had a unique personality. You had to respect it. On this day, we were a little bit north of Albuquerque, New Mexico when it happened. There had been reports of severe turbulence in the area, but those reports placed it about 200 miles north of our route of flight. So we didn't have any immediate reason for concern. And then, without a single second of warning, in perfectly clear air, the airplane was hit. What followed, for what seemed an eternity, it was probably just a few minutes, what followed was some of the most violent motion I had ever felt in an aircraft. That big airplane was pitching up, pitching down, rolling, and vibrating all simultaneously. The noise level rose, the air noise level rose, and the noise inside the cockpit was so dramatic that I had to actually yell at my first officer just to be heard. And then the warning systems came alive. Every pilot knows that moment when the cockpit starts talking to you at once. Something's wrong. But what happened next was something I had never seen before, and have never seen since, to be honest with you. The airplane simultaneously told me that we were going too fast with an overspeed warning, and also that we were going too slow, an impending stall warning, both at the same time, just alternating one to the other. Both warnings, opposite ends of the flight envelope, and they were triggered, at the same time. That's how violent this encounter really was. Thinking about the autopilot was on, a sophisticated multi-million-dollar system. It was trying to correct, the flight imbalances, but it couldn't keep up. The turbulence was overwhelming its ability to respond fast enough, no matter how much it cost. So I made a decision. I disengaged the autopilot and took the airplane under my control manually. You might ask now, why would I trust my hands over a sophisticated multi-million-dollar computer system in that moment? Well, let me tell you a little something about my background that might answer that question. Before I came into commercial aviation, I was a jet flight instructor for the U.S. Navy. I was a standardization pilot in a department that was called the Out of Control Flight Program. And that Out of Control Flight Program was a specialized course developed in the early 1980s, after the Navy began losing a fair number of F-14 aircraft, mainly to spins, and flat spins in particular. This was periodic, but it was a very negative trend. In any case, training command, we were tasked with taking student pilots who were about to begin the air combat maneuver training syllabus, where they'd be flying alone, flying very aggressively, but put them through an intensive spin recovery program to give them that training. Because if they were flying alone and their aircraft departed controlled flight at whatever altitude we're operating on, they need to know exactly what to do in the critical moments that followed. So I didn't just teach people how to fly basically, I also taught them how to recover aircraft that were completely out of control and get them back in their control. So when that MD-11 I was flying was pitching and rolling and the autopilot couldn't keep up and it was really confusing, I wasn't guessing. I was doing exactly what I'd spent years training others to do. Read the airplane, know where you are, know what's going on. Make a decision and fly the thing, fly it out. But even under my manual control, things were still unstable as I tried to hold altitude. I directed my first officer to declare an emergency and request an immediate descent. My instinct, built over decades and forged in that Navy program as well as my own experiences, told me we needed to get out of that altitude quickly. The air up there was just violent. We needed to get below it. So, air traffic control cleared us down immediately. I started down very slowly. And after descending just 2,000 feet to 350, flight level 350, or 35,000 feet, from 37,000 down to 35,000, this turbulence stopped completely, instantly, when I hit 35, like someone had just flipped a switch. So we continued down to 33,000 feet, just to get a little lower, and we stayed there, 33,000 feet, for the remaining 2 hours on our flight to Indianapolis. When we landed, I completed all the required paperwork that documented the incident in detail, and I requested a special maintenance inspection of the aircraft. According to what the instruments told us, we'd exceeded a number of flight limits, number of operational limits that day during that event. The warning systems had been screaming loud. Everything was flashing. So I wanted that airplane checked out from nose to tail just to see what had happened. So the maintenance crew did a very, very thorough inspection. And they found absolutely nothing. There's no damage whatsoever. There were no overstressed components. There was no sign that anything unusual had ever happened to the airplane at all. So they asked us again to recount, what I had written up. We told them. So, after a while, about 40 minutes, we ended up back at the hotel. And I recall going to my hotel room and turning on the television. So I was changing clothes. And I just looked at the news of the day. And I was surprised to see that the lead story, when I turned the TV on, was about a flight that day that experienced severe turbulence in northern New Mexico, but it was on its way to Denver, and it had a number of passengers who were badly injured during that event. I did a little more checking on my own, put a few things together, and found out that that flight was about 250 miles north of us when we ran into the severe turbulence. And believe it or not, since nothing wrong was found on my plane, that very next afternoon, I flew the same plane back to Oakland, California. On that flight, everything was smooth as silk the entire way. So to answer your question, Can turbulence flip an airplane upside down? I'm going to answer no. And what happened to me is actually the proof. What we encountered that morning was severe air turbulence, some of the most violent and unpredictable turbulence that exists. Because it's clear air, because it comes with no visible warning, no clouds, no radar return, nothing. Just air moving in a violently chaotic pattern, different directions, and it varies a lot at different altitudes. And even that, in that extreme event, with simultaneous overspeed and stall warnings going off, the autopilot was overwhelmed. We declared an emergency and all that. The airplane didn't flip over. It didn't even come close to flipping, actually. It pitched and rolled and yawed and vibrated, yes, but it flew. It kept flying. We flew the whole time. Because commercial aircraft are engineered with structural limits so far beyond what nature can throw at it that even the worst recorded turbulence events in aviation history have never flipped a commercial jet, as far as I've known. The reason goes back to the same physics we talked about earlier, some time ago, dynamic stability. The airplane wants to return to level flight when it's disturbed. Its aerodynamics are fighting for equilibrium constantly. Turbulence interrupts that equilibrium momentarily, sometimes violently, but the airplane's own design is always pushing it back towards straight and level. What those simultaneous warnings told me wasn't that the airplane was about to fail. They told me that the air itself was doing something extraordinary, moving so chaotically that the aircraft's sensors were seeing opposite conditions simultaneously. The airplane was caught between two extremes of the same violent air mass. And it handled it. Not great, but it handled it. The structure held. The flight controls responded as best they could. The airplane flew. The maintenance crew found nothing because there was nothing to find. The airplane was built for exactly that moment. And it performed. I wish it had done better, but overall it did perform. So, looking a little more at the MD-11 factor from a pilot's perspective, I mentioned that the MD-11 had unusual flight characteristics. And I want to be honest with you about what I meant. In that moment, with the autopilot overwhelmed and the warnings firing, I made a judgment call based on experience. I trusted my hands, not because the airplane was failing, but because I knew that airplane's personality. And I knew that direct manual input was the right tool for that situation. And that's what 50 years of flying gives you. Not fearlessness, but good judgment. The ability to read a situation, make a decision, and act. And in that case, the decision was simple. Get below the bad air. 2,000 feet later, it was over. Now, let's just think about the passenger experience, versus that reality. If you'd been a passenger on that flight, you would have been terrified. There's no other honest way to say it. The motion was violent. The noise was intense. And then it stopped. And you would have had no idea why or what had just happened. From the flight deck, we declared emergency, executed a descent, and resolved the situation in a matter of minutes. We knew what we were dealing with. We had the tools, we had the training, we had a plan. That gap between what you feel and what we know is the entire story of turbulence. It is almost always far less dangerous than it feels. And in the rare cases where it is genuinely severe, the airplane is actually built to handle it anyway. Nothing about that flight changed my confidence in commercial aviation. If anything, it deepened it, because I watched that airplane take everything the sky threw at it and come back for more the very next day. So, turbulence can't flip an airplane upside down. I've seen the worst it can do, and I flew that same airplane following day, without a second thought. If you want to feel that same confidence on your next flight, from the moment you push back from the gate to cruise altitude, I put together a 12-minute audio guide called the Takeoff Terror Eliminator. It walks you through every sound and sensation, so nothing catches you off guard. Turbulence, takeoff, all of it. It gets easier when you know what to expect. Check out the link in the description below. I'm Captain Paul. Fly safe. I'll talk to you soon. Cut.